Okay, this is our biodiversity PowerPoint, and this is video 1. This is going to be slides approximately 1 through 30 on the PowerPoint. So origins of life, we're starting with chemical change to form the first cells, and then it's turning into biological change. So you see starting with a lot of geological, small stuff, or big stuff, but formation of the earth, the crust, the atmosphere, all of the physical characteristics, and then you move into very small chemical changes, into larger chemical changes, and then into biological changes. So biological evolution, if you think about this whole concept as a clock, just to give yourselves an idea of the time frame involved here, we're starting at midnight, going all the way around to midnight again. All of this blue would be the geological change, the physical change, and then you start to see the chemical changes 1 billion years ago, moving into start the plants invading land at about 780 million years ago. Fossil record of animals. Moving up here, what's really, really interesting is when we start to hit land right around here. We hit reptiles 65 million years ago. That would be the dinosaurs. And then we're hitting mammals even sooner. What's really interesting is that modern humans appear about 2 seconds before midnight. Our recorded human history is about a quarter second before midnight. So we are incredibly, incredibly recent with everything else that has come before us. And this is the same diagram showing you the same thing. Notice, simple animals all the way up to the more complex. Okay, so how do we know what lived in the past? We look at fossils, we look at chemical analysis, DNA analysis, and then we take core samples out of buried ice, we take core samples out of rock. Anything that we can date back to that time period through like carbon isotope analysis, we will look at and compare. So natural selection, there's evolution, and then there's evolution by natural selection. So evolution in and of itself is a concept. The theory that animals can change based on genetic differences and evolve and change over time. Natural selection is the method of how they are changing, what causes those changes, and that's the difference. So it's through successive generations, it's variability in the genes, and it's mutation. So it's really, really random is the key thing to emphasize here, is that natural selection is a random process. It's not a premeditated thing, and it is inherited by the offspring. So that random change, that mutation is continued through the offspring. New species arise through hybridization. When two distinct species crossbreed, it only happens when you produce a fertile offspring. So in the case of a horse and a mule producing a donkey, that's great, but the donkey is sterile, so that doesn't do anything to produce a new species. So that's a hybrid, but it's just a hybrid. It's not a new species. Some species can exchange genes horizontally without sexual reproduction. That's really mostly a bacterial thing, sometimes a virus thing, and that's horizontal gene transfer. So the limitations on natural selection. It's limited by the gene pool, and it's limited by and by how fast it can reproduce. So for example, if you look at humans, we have a relatively slow generation time. It takes us a couple decades before we start to have kids. Most of the time, please guys, behave yourselves. And we have a relatively small number of young, relatively small output. Other species, ants and mice can reproduce like twice a month and have 6 or 8 kids, babies, whatever. So you end up with a much higher output and a much faster natural selection process because their reproduction time is faster and higher than ours. Common myths about evolution. It's not because they need the traits. So a lot of people think, evolution through natural selection is because they needed that trait. They needed to be faster. They needed to be bigger. They needed to be whatever. No, that's not the case at all. It's a random process that is always, always changing. There's no such thing as genetic perfection. It's always a mutative process. They developed them because it happened randomly, and the new random ones ended up surviving better than the old ones, so therefore they reproduced and multiplied better. So the ones that were faster or bigger or stronger ended up reproducing more because they survived longer, and those genes were the ones that were carried on. It's not that they developed the traits to match what they needed. Okay, so you can also have geologic processes, climate change, catastrophes, both man-made or natural catastrophes, and all of those affect evolution as well. The movement of the Earth's plates, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, all of those change species, disrupt species, help in speciation to form new species. They influence the climate, which determines what species are found and where. The movement of continents moves species around. So all of those big Earth processes definitely have an impact on biodiversity. If you look at the world, starting at the oldest, Pangea formed 225 million years ago, we're seeing one large continent that starts getting broken down into Laurasia and Gondwanaland. Forgot about that one. 135 million years ago, so we're seeing, for the first time, a couple random differences here. And then we see North and South America. Notice they're not connected for a while. So they're much more different than we would think. North America tends to be more with Eurasia. South America, even with more like Antarctica and stuff, before Antarctica got super cold. And then this is what we're looking at today. Okay, so climate change and natural selection. We know that the climate has changed. We know that that's impacted natural selection. Looking at the percent ice coverage has been the big difference, especially in changing mammals, types of animals, all of that stuff. Catastrophes. Asteroids and meteorites are the biggest ones hitting the Earth, with the upheavals there, the loss of the dinosaurs, stuff like that, where you've wiped out huge numbers of species, created opportunities for more species to come in. So this is, again, natural selection. It was a random chance. The dinosaurs were doing great. They were wiped out by the asteroid. And now we end up with all these new species, mammals, that now have the opportunity to live and thrive, where before they couldn't because the dinosaurs were doing much better than them competitively. Speciation is the formation of a new species. It happens when you crossbreed, or when the genetic makeup changes. Happens a lot when a member of a population, a group of individuals in a population become isolated for a long time. Whereas you used to have one, now you have two new species. That isolation can be geographical, so it can be based on the shape of the Earth, where they are. It can also be based on behavior of the animals as well, which we'll talk about later. So showing a geographic isolation, this is an example using foxes. You had an early fox population that was one species. They spread from into the northern and southern population. We have two different populations, and now we have two different species. This is speciation. We have an Arctic fox that is adapted to the cold weather. They heavier fur, shorter ears, shorter legs, the fur that matches the snow. And then the gray fox in the southern population is adapted to the heat. Different coat color, again, to camouflage itself. So these different environmental conditions push different pressures, different natural selection pressures on the animals, and therefore evolution has taken different turns, because the ones up here that were lighter in color, that blended in with the snow, survived better than the ones this color. So you can see where it'd be very difficult or very easy to get confused with they changed because they changed into what they needed, not really they changed by accident, and the ones that changed for the better survived. We just don't see all the ones that didn't change for the better because they did not survive. Okay, so the human impact, talked about this a lot already. Our size and resource use is growing. Our industry, our agriculture, our production consumption is all growing. That has degraded natural ecosystems. It's altered chemical and energy cycles, changes, and then therefore changes numbers and distribution of species, adds pollution, climate change, and loss of biodiversity are the final two effects of that. Same diagram. Okay, so why should we care about biodiversity? Two reasons. If you are a money person, for the use value. Economic and ecological services, we need high biodiversity because that keeps food webs healthy for our food sources. It keeps pest control down. It makes our life easier, believe it or not, for a number of reasons. If you're not so much concerned about the money part of it, the non-use value is simply because it's pretty, simply because we want to be able to give a high biodiversity planet to our children. We want their existence to be more happy, the animals to be more happy. So it really kind of depends on where you fall on that scale. If it's some of both, that's great. Really no right or wrong answer there, but depending on who you're arguing with, this is why we need to keep high biodiversity. You can go with the people that value money or the people that value aesthetics. The forests. I'll let you peruse through this, hit pause, and kind of go through each of these, as none of it is anything that we haven't talked about before. Types of forest. An old-growth forest is uncut or regenerated, hasn't been disturbed for several hundred years. We're talking about 22% of the world's forests, and it hosts species with specialized niches, very, very specialized critters. Second-growth forest, secondary succession, planted, not as old, usually human impacted. Tree plantation is when we are planting like for Christmas trees, all 1 or 2 or 3 species, relatively low biodiversity, relatively young. Deforestation, again, I'll let you guys look through this. It's nothing you don't know already, but make sure that you pause and take the time to kind of read through these and make sure you understand all of them. When you lose a forest, this is what happens. This is what happens to each of these things. So make sure that you guys can list off a few of these. Harvesting trees. You have to build roads to get in because it's inaccessible. So that starts the process of fragmentation, of breaking down the forest, starts the destruction and degradation of the ecosystem. And you see, as stuff goes on into more advanced. Same diagram. Harvesting trees, they can be harvested individually from diverse forests. You can harvest the entire forest, it's clear cutting, or just portions of the forest, and that's strip cutting. So selective cutting looks like this. You're just kind of thinning out the forest. You're trying not to take away a lot of the biodiversity, and you're leaving as much as you can. Clear cutting is wiping away everything. And then strip cutting is exactly what it sounds like, taking in strips. So you would make your road, you leave uncut above and below. You would have, cut 3 to 10 years ago, it's starting to grow back, and then cut here, and you kind of take turns and continue to harvest. So you're up close of the selective cutting. Again, you see that's just thinning stuff out. Notice in all of these you have the road because you always have to have access to get your lumber out of the forest. Clear cutting is taking everything, and then strip cutting is taking pieces. Clear cutting forests, advantages and disadvantages of both. This is one of the ones that really gets people, and you see the difference. This is what people, gets people the most upset a lot of time because it's such a dramatic change.
Just a reminder that we do have a CIIC meeting today.
So make sure that you guys go through
We're going to be at 500, room 500, and we will start at 2:45.
Okay, so make sure that you guys go through and check through the advantages and disadvantages of each of these. Make sure you're comfortable with each of these. Sustainable forestry is what, we kind of talked about this at the beginning of the school year with the 2 books that we read. Forestry is not going to be eliminated altogether. It's too much money involved in it. People need houses. It's going to continue. So what we need to concentrate on is being sustainable about it. Keep and protect some forest areas so we keep that biodiversity. Make sure that you're rotating through so that we have more timber available on longer rotations. We're getting those old growth trees. Rely more on the selective and strip cutting as opposed to just taking everything. We don't want to clear cut in the steep slopes because that causes crazy erosion and much more problems in the long run. We want to keep those old growth forests, so stop logging there and then just take what we've already harvested, replant, and take again. None of this is really rocket science. It all seems very self-explanatory. It's getting people to follow these rules. It's the challenge. So make sure you go through and look at these options for sustainable forestry. And we're going to stop there.